So my name is Rhyne, and I'm here to talk about RSpec, specifically RSpec in 15 minutes for beginners. Sometimes learning new tools, you just need that little bit of a nudge at the beginning to get your mind around what the tool is and get to use it. RSpec has become a popular testing tool in the Rails community. Some people can debate it on RSpec versus test unit, but that's not what I'm here to do. To give you an idea what I'm going to go over, I'll be talking about how to get yourself set up with RSpec. Most of you have been around for Rails for a while. It'll be kind of boring to you, but it's what you need to do to get yourself going. I'll kind of go over the structure of what a spec is, and go over the Scaffold Generation with RSpec, and then kind of go over some next steps for people who've kind of gone through these phases and what's the next thing that they would need to do. So starting off with setup, first thing is install the gem. Pretty simple, and this would allow you to be able to use it with TextPad and other third-party gems. There's a lot of third-party gems that work with RSpec for one thing or another to make it easier to test and test often. The second thing is when you're working on a specific project, you'll need to set up a plugin, and you'll need to generate the RSpec specific scaffolding. So it's just a couple of commands. It takes you just a moment to install it into your project, and you got to install the generalized one in the RSpec on Rails. And then the bottom part generates just some project level scaffolding. You only have to run it once for your project. You don't have to run it repeatedly as you make other changes to your RSpec. And then just to manually go to run it, you just run rake. And there's other tools that will do automation with it, where I'll be running them in the background. But just as the simple as getting you going, the manual way to run it is rake. So, kind of going into the structure of a spec. This is what a basic spec would look like. This one is going and getting a list of snowmen from the website. And so you have at the top, it describes handling the get snowmen, and then it has a before section, and then a spec that starts with it, as in it should be successful. And then I'll go into the individual pieces. So first is the describe part, and this just groups a bunch of individual specs and kind of creates a hierarchy. You can nest these, so you can have very detailed describe ones, and then you have more general ones of this describes a whole controller, or this describes all the views, or a section of views, or whatever, and then you have like this describes this part of the controller. And this also helps out with not just grouping the individual specs, but some of the setup and teardown functions, which I'll get into now. They've been called different things by different testing frameworks, but this one's calling it before and after. So you can specify it to run either before for each individual spec, or before for all the specs in the given describe section. And you can also use after. And this one is fairly basic. It just creates a mock of Snowman, which is just a fake class. It doesn't do anything special. You have to define all this functionality, but it behaves kind of sort of like a snowman. And in this case, I'm making it stub the find function, which just makes it pretend that it has a find function, and when you send the find function, or when you make a call to the find function, it will return the list of one snowman. And you can play around with this. There's also ones that are less stubs and more like mocks of individual functions, where you can require that you get a call for with specific parameters. You can get calls for a specific number of times, and it gets a lot more complicated there. But the simple way is stuff that just gets you started. And then this is what an individual spec looks like. And the first line is just describing what the spec is doing. This, when you have an error with the spec, and I'm sure there's other tools that will print out all the details of all the specs you have in there. That's the text that is human readable that you'll see that will tell you what's going on. And so in this case it's saying that the get for snowman should be successful, and the first line is just getting the index, and then the response should be successful. And the response should be successful line is where things get a little complicated. For someone who's used to a normal, or not normal, but a more traditional language, they would look at that and they'd be confused. And there's a little bit of magic going on behind the scenes. The be success part is actually making a call to the success question mark method in the response object. So you need to make sure you have one of those defined. And then there's other ones. Instead of should, there's should not and whatnot. So you'll need to look at the RSpec documentation to find out all those details. So moving on to the scaffold generation, one of the things I particularly like about Rails in general, and also appreciate in RSpec, is that they have scaffold generation that gets you started and get you up and running quickly, from which you can then do all your development. And so they still have scaffold for RSpec, but instead of doing just script generate scaffold, you do script generate RSpec scaffold, and then pass in parameters the same as you would normally. And so for those watching the podcast, the question was, is this scaffold generation specific to Rails? And the answer provided was yes, as the scaffolding is part of Rails in general, and then the RSpec scaffold is part of the RSpec on Rails plugin that was installed. So this not only generates the regular scaffolding, and there's others where it can just do for the model or just the controller if you just want that, but there's also, it also will generate all of the corresponding scaffolding, so it'll create fixtures for you, it'll create the specs for the models, which will be very bare bones, and the controller and the views, and just kind of gets you going. You'll need to go in and put in more detail if you really want these to be valuable tests, but at the very least, if you don't do anything in there, it'll tell you if something breaks. So this is an example of what the model spec is. This is actually what the entire generated model spec looks like. This is very, very basic. And from here, you can expand it and add more things before if the snowman is more than just the name, but you add things like it has 3 pieces of charcoal, it has a magical hat, and it has a carrot for a nose. You add things like that, and you can expand more on the before. And if you have other things in the model like check for validation, you can check and see if this is a valid snowman or if it's just a lump of snow. And kind of going into next steps, just to give you an idea, now that you've got a general idea about what RSpec is and what you can do with it, first thing is to go check out the RSpec website. There's a lot more detailed documentation than I can go into this time, and you'll learn a lot more about all the things you can do beyond just the response should and should not such. And you also want to look into installing and configuring Zen-Test. It's one thing to just manually run the tests yourself, but there's a lot of tools like Zen-Test out there that you can have running in the background, and they'll just run the test as you make changes, and that just takes one more piece of programming off of your mind of having to remember, oh yeah, did I run the test? And they also can be incorporated in different check-in and deployment tools. So, does anyone have any questions first off? I've used this in a very small team environment, but I have not used this in a larger team environment. I don't have experience with that specifically. I know that when I've worked with other testing tools, the question was, does this work in a team environment, and can this be handed off to other developers and can they read this well? I've done a lot with JUnit and with TestNG, both Java testing frameworks and some other ones, and some of them get pretty messy, and I'm really impressed with how simple and elegant this one is. It does a lot more of the behind-the-scenes magic for you. It actually generates semi-meaningful tests from the beginning, which I have not seen at all from Java, and I've actually done graduate research trying to figure out. So I'm actually really impressed with this.
That concludes this episode of the SD.RB podcast. See you next time.